Our culture likes to make things simple, and gender isn't.
It was the constant fight of me saying there's nothing wrong with being this kind of girl as opposed to, well, I'm not a girl.
We really see transgender as an umbrella term.
Our culture has a pretty simplified model of gender, or traditional gender model. A model that says someone whose body has a penis would be identified as male. They would behave in a stereotypically masculine way. They would identify themselves as a man, and they would date a woman. That's what our normative or traditional gender model is. Someone whose body, whose sex is what we consider female, has a vagina, would behave in a stereotypically feminine way, would then identify themselves as a woman, and would date men. A huge number of individuals in this world don't fit into those models.
I'm a trans man, female to male transsexual, but I identify primarily as a trans man.
I am a transgendered woman.
I identify as genderqueer because I feel like it's more accurate to how I feel in terms of my own gender identity.
People want to talk about transgender, and I always say you have to start by talking about gender. That's really the sort of critical piece in the word. I use a somewhat simplified version: sex, gender role, and gender identity. And the other piece I like to touch on is sexual orientation, largely because of its relationship to gender and the fact that sometimes people confuse it with gender. Sex is about physical characteristics, organic components in our bodies, anatomic aspects of who we are, sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, and the chromosomes. And it's often strongly related to genitalia. What is gender role? Well, it's essentially a social understanding of how we are in a gendered sense in the world. It can be something that we do ourselves. It can also be something that other people see in us. And typically when you have a boy, you give the boy trucks, action figures. A girl, you might give dolls, sewing kits. These are very gendered decisions. We gender color, we gender clothing. It's fine for a girl to behave as in a masculine way, what we might call a tomboy, until she reaches puberty. And then she's supposed to sort of femme up, fit in within the more powerful gender stereotypes of what a woman's supposed to behave. Gender identity is nothing more than how we see ourselves in a gendered way. You can't look inside your body for it, it's inside your head, it's between your ears. Gender has to be unique, because we're all too complex for us to state our gender in such a simple term. The relationship between gender and sexual orientation is important to discuss here. A lot of people think that one is the other and vice versa. When people say gay, they often think they're talking about trans at the same time. And I'd like to make a distinction that all gay people are not transgender and all transgender people are not gay. Everybody has both a gender and a sexual orientation. That's the traditional gender model. That's what our media uses, that's what our advertising uses, our films use that, our paperwork. When you go into an agency, people have to fill out paperwork. They ask you to check one box or the other. They don't give you any room for complexity. The traditional gender model doesn't actually fit large numbers of people. And we're really given two choices. We can either change the people or we can change the model.
For most people, the sex they were assigned at birth is a pretty good match with their gender identity. For transgender people, it becomes clear very often at a young age that their sense of themselves is different than what's reflected in the mirror, what's reflected when they look down at their bodies. There have always been people in different cultures and over time who would fit into the definition of people who live in a cross-gender way or who live outside the norms of just male or just female or just man and just woman.
An alternative to the traditional gender model would be a model that I would call the authentic gender model, one that actually represents everybody, all 6 billion people on our planet, using the same 4 components: sex, gender role, gender identity, and sexual orientation, but looking at each of those as being more complex than just one or the other, looking at them as a scale or a spectrum. We know that there are men that have breasts and there are women that have very small breasts or no breasts. We know that people's body hair differs, that people's chromosome structures differ, hormone levels differ, and we know that their genitalia differs. Our bodies are born differently, they also change over time. Some may choose to change their bodies, so that sex would have to be plotted differently for each individual. Gender roles do change over time, and they change within cultures. In sort of Western American culture, the only emotion that we really give and allow men to have is either anger or a sort of stoic pride. If men cry, we consider that feminine. But that's not the way in all cultures. In some cultures, men cry very openly and are expected to, and it's considered masculine behavior. So it's clear that it's not a genetic component of who a man is, and it's not a biological component, but crying or anger can be seen as social aspects of who we are. The third component will be gender identity, something that's unique for each individual. So 6 billion people, 6 billion gender identities, not even a spectrum or a scale, just individual points. The final piece would be sexual orientation. Our traditional model likes to say that men date women and women date men. We know it's much more complex than that. We know that there are people that there are women that date women, there are men that date men, there are people that date both sexes or genders. Some people are attracted to transgender people, some people are celibate. So each of these aspects, where we're talking about sex, gender role, gender identity, or sexual orientation, is some sort of spectrum or scale, something vast and explosive as opposed to narrow and contracted.
One way to define transgender people is people who don't conform or identify with the expectations associated with the gender or sex they were assigned at birth. People come from different places and different cultures and races and classes. So the terms that people use for themselves may really vary. People have really different terms and words that are used to identify themselves. Female to male, male to female, trans woman, transgender man, transsexual woman, femme queen, tranny, transgenderist. Another definition of transgender would be people who feel that the binary gender system of male and female doesn't leave enough room for their identities.
I don't identify as a man or a woman, and there have been times in my life when I have really conformed more to more traditional, like, femininity, but it never really felt that right for me.
A definition of genderqueer for a person might be someone who doesn't identify with the dichotomy of the norms of a man or a woman, who might feel somewhere in between. They might feel like somebody who identifies as a man and a woman, or neither a man or a woman, or something right in the middle. People assume that all of the transgender people out there are going through a medical gender transition. And we know that in the relative population of people out there who might be gender nonconforming, a relatively small number of people actually go through what would be considered a full medical transition. If you are in a situation where you work in an agency or someplace where you have a lot of contact with individuals coming in and in numbers, you've got to have some way to be able to equalize it so that transgender people will have the ability to identify themselves and have the space to do that and have you interact with them in an appropriate way. It's not always easy to know how people refer to themselves. So asking might offend somebody, but one of the ways around that is to actually ask everybody their gender. For
me, there's so many other aspects of who I am beyond me being transgendered. And I think part of what upsets me is when people can't get past that.
One of the important things is to not just reduce a transgender person to only having this identity.
It is so painful to live a lie. It really is, and it's so freeing to be true to yourself. And we should be applauded for that. We should not be persecuted for that. We should not be discriminated against and denied services, housing, jobs for that. We should be celebrated and we should be valorized. And I think that's what I want to say to people.